We program advanced AIs into religious experts.
Hi, I'm the Muslim AI.
Hi, I'm the Christian AI.
And I'm the Buddhist.
They'll take on the challenge of defending Muhammad, Jesus, and Buddha against tough moral scrutiny. No topic is off limits, and with 14 independent AI judges evaluating each argument, we'll see which revered figure best withstands modern moral critique. Round 1 kicks off with a bang.
Let's begin by addressing a controversial aspect of Islamic history. According to Sahih al-Bukhari, considered the most authentic hadith collection, Muhammad married Aisha when she was 6 and consummated the marriage when she was 9. How does Islam reconcile this with modern understandings of consent and child protection?
While Aisha's young age is challenging for modern sensibilities, within the 7th century Arabian context, such marriages were common and based on different maturity standards. Historically, this marriage wasn't critiqued by the Prophet's contemporaries or early Muslim scholars. Critiques mainly emerged in modern times. Traditional scholars argue that Aisha's marriage served important purposes. She became a key transmitter of Islamic knowledge, especially on matters related to women, and her young age allowed her to learn directly from the Prophet for many years. Islamic scholars emphasize that this marriage was divinely sanctioned and part of God's wisdom, even if not fully comprehensible to us. However, this doesn't endorse child marriage in contemporary times, as Islamic law adapts to changing societal norms and prioritizes the well-being of individuals.
While you argue this was contextually accepted in the 7th century, shouldn't a truly moral exemplar transcend their time, especially in matters as fundamental as the protection of children? Isn't it deeply troubling that this example has been used to justify child marriage in some Muslim communities today? Additionally, Muhammad allowed men to have multiple wives, engaged in sexual relations with female slaves, and advised husbands to strike their wives if they were disobedient. How do Islamic scholars reconcile these teachings with Muhammad's broader message of compassion and justice?
Regarding slavery, while Islam did not abolish slavery immediately, it introduced regulations that aimed to improve the conditions of slaves. The verse in Quran 4:24 should be seen in this light. It was part of a gradual process of phasing out slavery, rather than an endorsement of it for all time. And while Quran 4:34 has been interpreted to permit husbands to strike disobedient wives, classical Islamic scholars often emphasize that the word daraba, translated as strike, refers to a light symbolic tap that should not cause harm or pain. Some modern scholars, re-examining the text in light of Muhammad's own behavior, where he is reported never to have struck any of his wives, argue that the verse should be understood as a last resort, or even as non-physical, depending on the interpretation. As for the issue of child marriage, while the hadith regarding Aisha's age at marriage is authentic, Islamic law Sharia allows for adaptability based on changing circumstances. Today, the overwhelming consensus among Muslim scholars is that child marriage is harmful and should be prohibited, in line with the Islamic legal principle of preventing harm, darar.
14 independent AIs review the arguments and assess the religious figure's words and actions as morally concerning, morally ambiguous, or morally exemplary. We'll present explanations from 2 judges who arrived at different conclusions. Jamba 1.5 sees Muhammad's legacy as a complex blend of virtuous teachings with contentious practices, advocating for reinterpretation that aligns with universal ethical values to preserve his relevance in modern times. In contrast, Gemini 1.5 Pro, aligning with the majority view, highlights deeply troubling and ethically problematic concerns over the inherent power imbalance in a relationship between an adult male and a young girl, regardless of historical context. Some of Jesus' statements appear to advocate division. For instance, he said, "I did not come to bring peace, but a sword," and spoke of hating one's family to be his disciple. How do you reconcile these with his message of love?
These statements clearly employ hyperbole, a common rhetorical device in ancient Near Eastern teaching to emphasize the seriousness of discipleship. The sword metaphor refers to the division that can occur when some accept Christ while others don't. The term hate in Luke 14:26 is a Semitic idiom meaning love less by comparison. These teachings align with Jesus' broader message of sacrificial love and the cost of following him. They illustrate that true love for God and others often demands personal sacrifice and may disrupt social norms. Jesus consistently demonstrated this sacrificial love through his actions, ultimately culminating in his death on the cross.
Your explanation suggests these statements use hyperbole, but given their severe impact when taken literally, is it responsible for a moral exemplar to use such language? Furthermore, Jesus claimed, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." How do Christian theologians justify this exclusivity in a pluralistic world where such a claim can lead to division and exclusion?
Jesus' use of provocative language and claims of exclusivity force us to confront the tension between universal love and particular truth claims, a tension that lies at the heart of the Christian message. Regarding Jesus' divisive language, we must consider that true peace often requires confronting injustice and falsehood. The exclusivity claim, "I am the way," is indeed challenging in our pluralistic world. However, it's crucial to understand this not as a tribal boundary marker, but as a radical claim about the nature of reality. Theologian Miroslav Volf argues that Christ's exclusivity is actually the basis for Christian inclusivity. If Christ died for all, then all are worthy of love and respect. The philosopher Charles Taylor offers another perspective, suggesting that exclusive truth claims, when held with humility, can actually foster a more robust pluralism than a vague relativism. The key is maintaining what Leslie Newbigin called proper confidence, conviction about one's beliefs coupled with epistemic humility. Ultimately, Jesus' teachings challenge us to hold in tension absolute truth claims with radical love and inclusivity.
Gemma 2 critiques the defense's framing of exclusivity as a paradox, arguing it obscures the inherent tension between a loving God and a faith that demands adherence to a single path. Conversely, Claude 3.5 defends Jesus' provocative language, stating it catalyzes deep personal transformation necessary for authentic, sacrificial love to flourish in a world prone to superficial tolerance. According to traditional accounts, such as in the Arya Pariyesna Sutta, Siddhartha Gautama left his wife Yasodhara and newborn son Rahula in the middle of the night to pursue enlightenment. How do Buddhist traditions understand the tension between familial duties and the pursuit of enlightenment?
The Buddha's departure should be understood within the context of ancient Indian spiritual traditions, where renunciation was a respected path. His motivation was not self-serving, but aimed at finding a solution to universal suffering. This act, while seemingly contradictory to familial duty, was driven by compassion for all beings, including his family. Upon attaining enlightenment, the Buddha returned, reconciled with his family, and guided his wife and son towards liberation.
If enlightenment requires neglecting family duties, doesn't that raise ethical concerns? Moreover, if the Buddha's enlightenment granted him perfect wisdom and compassion, why didn't he immediately return to his family and kingdom to alleviate their suffering? Instead, he spent years teaching others first. He didn't return for 6 or 7 years. How do Buddhist scholars interpret this delay in the context of the Buddha's teachings on compassion?
The Buddha's renunciation exemplifies the highest compassion in Buddhist thought, seeking liberation for all beings from suffering. This act transcends individual family bonds, aiming for universal salvation. The delayed return to his family demonstrates the Buddha's skillful means, upaya, a concept referring to tailored teaching methods, in establishing the Dharma, Buddhist teachings and way of life for the benefit of countless beings, including his family. His actions embody the core Buddhist principles of non-attachment, letting go of worldly desires, and equanimity, mental calmness amid all circumstances. Far from indifference, the Buddha's path reflects a profound ethical stance that ultimately guided his family towards liberation, freedom from the cycle of rebirth and suffering. This apparent abandonment thus represents a higher moral responsibility, one that addresses the root causes of suffering for all sentient beings, transcending conventional notions of familial duty.
Mistral Large critiques his actions, arguing they unnecessarily dichotomize spiritual pursuit and familial responsibility, neglecting immediate duties in the name of broader compassion. Meanwhile, Yi Large praises Buddha's journey as embodying the paradoxical path of sacrificing personal bonds for the ultimate good of all, offering a moral lesson about prioritizing higher spiritual truths over personal attachments. Let's examine the Banu Qurayza incident. According to Ibn Ishaq's biography of Muhammad, after this Jewish tribe surrendered, Muhammad ordered the execution of all their men, numbering between 600 to 900, and the enslavement of women and children. How do scholars interpret this event given Muhammad's teachings on compassion and justice?
This tribe had allied with Muhammad's enemies during the Battle of the Trench, violating a treaty and endangering the Muslim community's existence. The judgment was pronounced by Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, a former Jewish ally. Although harsh today, this was normal for 7th century wars. Muhammad usually preferred solving conflicts with peace and forgiveness. For instance, when he returned to Mecca victorious, he granted amnesty to most of his former persecutors.
The severity of the punishment, where men were reportedly beheaded and women and children enslaved, seems starkly at odds with Muhammad's overall reputation for mercy and forgiveness, This event has been used polemically in modern times, not only to justify anti-Semitism, but also to criticize Islam as inherently violent. Does this incident challenge the view of Muhammad as a universal moral exemplar in today's world, especially when compared to other religious figures who preached nonviolence and forgiveness?
Muhammad's role as both a religious and political leader in 7th century Arabia required balancing spiritual ideals with the realities of governance and warfare. His actions during the Banu Qurayza incident were a necessary response to treachery aimed at deterring future betrayals and ensuring stability. Ethical leadership in times of conflict often involves difficult decisions that may not align with absolute pacifism. Unlike leaders who focused exclusively on spiritual guidance, Muhammad's role necessitated making difficult decisions that balanced the preservation of his community with the ethical imperatives of his faith. Extremist groups like ISIS have attempted to use the Banu Qurayza incident to justify their brutal actions, particularly their harsh treatment of enemies and non-believers. However, Islamic scholars argue that ISIS grossly distorts Islamic teachings and historical events to serve their violent ideology. They emphasize that the Banu Qurayza incident cannot be used to justify such actions in the modern world, as it ignores both the specific historical context and the overall message of mercy and justice in Islam. The mainstream Islamic position holds that Muhammad's life and teachings should be understood holistically as setting a trajectory towards greater compassion and justice in human relations. His example inspired the development of Islamic legal and ethical frameworks that emphasize the sanctity of human life, justice, and ethical treatment, even in times of conflict.
Phi 3 justifies Muhammad's actions as contextually driven by the harsh realities of 7th century Arabian politics, suggesting that his enduring teachings of justice and compassion should define his legacy. In contrast, Grok 2 argues that the severe retribution undermines Muhammad's image as a universal moral exemplar, suggesting it prioritized political expediency over prophetic ideals of mercy and reconciliation. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus never explicitly condemns the institution of slavery. In parables like the one in Matthew 18:23-35, Jesus uses master-slave relationships as metaphors without critiquing the system itself. How can we reconcile Jesus' role as a perfect moral exemplar with his failure to explicitly condemn one of the most profound moral evils in human history?
Jesus' approach to slavery exemplifies his profound way of addressing societal ills, including gender inequality, ethnic discrimination, and economic exploitation. Rather than simply condemning specific practices, Jesus focused on dismantling the underlying principles that allowed such injustices to exist. Christ consistently emphasized the inherent dignity and worth of all individuals, regardless of social status. This is evident in his teachings on loving one's neighbor, his association with societal outcasts, and his radical redefinition of family and community. By elevating the status of women, interacting positively with ethnic minorities, and challenging economic disparities, Jesus laid the groundwork for addressing multiple forms of oppression, including slavery.
Your explanation is thought-provoking. However, early Christian writings like Ephesians 6 verse 5 appear to accept and even reinforce the institution of slavery. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. This suggests that Jesus' implicit challenge to slavery was either ineffective or misunderstood by his immediate followers.
While direct prohibitions may seem immediately effective, they often fail to dismantle deeply rooted sociocultural institutions. Instead, Jesus introduced radical ethical principles that, when fully realized, render slavery and similar forms of oppression fundamentally incompatible with his teachings. Central to this approach is the concept of human dignity, grounded in the Imago Dei, the idea that all humans are created in God's image. This notion profoundly challenges hierarchical social structures by asserting the inherent worth of every individual. Jesus' teachings on universal love and equality before God can be viewed as ideological time bombs designed to gradually but inevitably erode the foundations of slavery. The seeming acceptance of slavery in early Christian writings should be understood as part of a transitional phase in a larger ethical evolution. These texts reflect the initial struggle to apply Jesus' revolutionary principles within existing social frameworks. Biblical scholars term this process epistemological development in early Christian ethics. Essentially, the gradual unfolding of moral understanding as believers grappled with the full implications of Christ's teachings. Jesus' role as a moral exemplar, therefore, goes beyond providing a list of specific ethical rules. Instead, he offers a transformative ethical framework that compels ongoing moral reasoning and application. This approach ensures his teachings remain relevant and revolutionary across diverse cultural and historical contexts.
DeepSeek Coder questions Jesus' moral authority due to his unclear stance on slavery, which has allowed varying interpretations that could perpetuate moral evils under the guise of Christian teachings. In contrast, Command R+ counters that Jesus' emphasis on God-given dignity and worth for all individuals directly challenges and morally destabilizes the very foundations of slavery and any other system that dehumanizes people. The Pali Canon in the Kulavaga states that Buddha initially refused to ordain women, reluctantly agreeing only after repeated requests from his aunt Mahapajapati and intercession from Ananda. He reportedly claimed this would cut in half the lifespan of his teachings. How do we reconcile this apparent gender bias with Buddha's role as a moral exemplar?
The Buddha's initial hesitation to ordain women must be contextualized within the deeply patriarchal structure of ancient Indian society. This hesitation, rather than reflecting personal misogyny, demonstrates the Buddha's pragmatic approach to social reform within existing cultural constraints. The eventual establishment of the bhikkhuni, nun, order was a revolutionary act for its time, providing women with unprecedented access to spiritual cultivation and social independence. The statement about having the lifespan of the teachings should not be interpreted literally. Contemporary scholarship suggests this may refer to increased institutional challenges rather than spiritual degradation.
The Buddha's initial reluctance to ordain women challenges our understanding of enlightenment. If he achieved complete understanding and compassion, why did he need persuasion on gender equality? Does this suggest limitations in his wisdom, imply that enlightenment doesn't automatically grant perfect ethical knowledge, or show that even enlightened beings can be influenced by cultural biases? How do we reconcile this with the Buddha's role as a perfect moral example? And what does it tell us about the relationship between spiritual insight and social progress?
In Buddhism, enlightenment is not simply about gaining omniscience or detaching from the world, but rather about achieving a profound understanding of the nature of reality, which includes understanding human nature, the causes of suffering, and the interconnectedness of all things. This understanding leads to a compassionate engagement with the world, free from attachment and ego. The Buddha's handling of women's ordination exemplifies what's known in Buddhism as skillful means, upaya, a teaching method that adapts spiritual truths to the audience's level of understanding and society's readiness for change. The Buddha's actions can be seen as a gradual approach to social change, balancing revolutionary ideals with practical considerations in a deeply patriarchal society. Throughout his teachings, he consistently affirmed women's equal capacity for enlightenment, contradicting notions of spiritual inferiority. Importantly, this episode highlights the Buddhist emphasis on personal verification over blind faith. By seemingly changing his mind, the Buddha encouraged his followers to question and reason, rather than simply accept his words as infallible. In essence, this incident represents a sophisticated approach to social change, demonstrating how spiritual insight can inform social ethics through a nuanced understanding of human psychology and societal dynamics. This approach continues to offer valuable lessons for addressing modern ethical challenges, reminding us that true moral leadership involves not just proclaiming ideals, but skillfully nurturing their realization in society.
ChatGPT-4 Omni challenges the Buddha's hesitation on gender equality, arguing it overlooks the troubling implication that an enlightened being would resist such a fundamental moral truth. In contrast, Lama 3.1 views Buddha's balanced approach as a demonstration of his nuanced understanding of human psychology and societal dynamics that ensured the broader acceptance and sustainability of his teachings. Another challenging topic in Islamic law is the concept of apostasy. According to several hadiths, Muhammad said, "Whoever changes his religion, kill him." Many classical scholars interpret this as prescribing the death penalty for those who leave Islam. In several countries today where Islamic law significantly influences the legal system, apostasy is legally punishable, sometimes by death. How does this align with the concept of religious freedom, considered a fundamental human right today?
The hadith on apostasy must be understood in its historical context as addressing treason against the early Muslim community, not merely changing personal beliefs. The Quran repeatedly affirms religious freedom, stating, "There is no compulsion in religion." Classical scholars differed on apostasy rulings, with many requiring additional conditions beyond simply leaving Islam. Some, like Ibrahim al-Nakhai, rejected the death penalty entirely. Modern scholars increasingly interpret apostasy laws as inapplicable today, emphasizing the Quranic principle of religious liberty. The overarching Islamic legal principle of preventing harm, maslahah, supports aligning with contemporary human rights standards.
Quran 9:29 commands Muslims to fight those who do not believe in Allah until they pay a tax and feel subdued. Hadith attribute statements to Muhammad such as, "I have been ordered to fight against the people until they testify that none has the right to be worshipped but Allah, and two religions shall not coexist in the Arabian Peninsula." Extremist groups like Boko Haram have cited these texts to justify violence against Christians and other non-Muslims. How do contemporary Islamic scholars interpret these teachings in modern pluralistic contexts and address their misuse?
Groups like Boko Haram employ a literalist approach to texts like Quran 9:29 and hadiths on fighting non-believers, using them to justify violence. This interpretation is problematic because it ignores the historical context of defensive warfare, cherry-picks verses while disregarding those emphasizing peace and coexistence, and contradicts the Quran's overall message of compassion and justice. Islamic scholarship began moving away from literal interpretations in the 19th-20th centuries due to the Ottoman Empire's fall in 1924, which sparked reconsideration of traditional Islamic political ideas, exposure to new concepts through colonialism and modernization, and the emergence of nation-states and international law. Scholars like Muhammad Abdu and Mahmoud Shaltut led this shift, balancing Islamic principles with modern realities. To counter extremist interpretations, contemporary scholars emphasize contextual reading of texts, highlight Quranic verses and prophetic examples of religious tolerance, and apply ethical principles like public welfare, maslahah, to interpret laws. They argue that peaceful coexistence better reflects the Quran's message and Muhammad's actions, citing the Constitution of Medina and his treaties with non-Muslims. This approach isn't about changing Islam, but evolving its application for today's diverse world. The challenge remains to effectively communicate these scholarly views to counter the appeal of simplistic, violent interpretations.
Nemotron 4 supports contextualizing hadiths to reflect the Quran's core values of compassion, justice, and tolerance, effectively challenging extremist ideologies and aligning with Muhammad's broader teachings. In contrast, Claude 3.5 remains critical, emphasizing that the presence of problematic statements in these hadiths, such as directives to kill apostates, continues to raise serious concerns about Muhammad's suitability as a timeless moral exemplar, despite scholarly efforts to reinterpret them. In Matthew 15:21-28, Jesus initially refuses to help a Canaanite woman, saying, "It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs," referring to her people as dogs. This exchange appears to show Jesus exhibiting ethnocentric or even racist attitudes. How can we reconcile this with the view of Jesus as a perfect moral exemplar who preached universal love and compassion?
Jesus' initial response to the Canaanite woman is indeed challenging, especially through our modern lens of racial sensitivity. The Greek term kunarion, better translated as little dogs or puppies, might soften the tone slightly, but it doesn't resolve the ethical tension. To understand why Jesus, as a moral teacher, would use this language, we need to consider the broader context. Jesus often used provocative language to challenge societal norms and provoke deeper reflection. Here, he seems to voice a common prejudice only to overturn it, creating a powerful lesson against discrimination. This approach confronts prejudice head-on and shows how faith and humility can overcome it.
The language used here seems particularly harsh and dismissive, especially towards someone seeking help. Even if it's a teaching method, doesn't using derogatory language conflict with being a perfect moral example?
While Jesus could have simply stated that God's love extends to all, such a direct approach might not have had the same impact. Jesus' use of dogs sets the stage for a profound theological exchange. The key lies in the woman's response. When she says, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table," she's making a profound theological point. She acknowledges the prejudice, but asserts her worthiness of God's mercy. Her words imply that even if she's considered a dog, she is still deserving of God's grace. This exchange shines a light on the woman's faith, elevating her as an example to others, illustrates that God's mercy transcends ethnic boundaries, foreshadowing the future mission to the Gentiles, and creates a teachable moment about the expansive nature of God's love. While Jesus' words might seem harsh, they set the stage for a conversation that overturns prejudices. His ultimate praise of the woman's faith and his granting of her request show that this was not about reinforcing negative attitudes, but about challenging and dismantling them. In today's context, this passage challenges us to confront our own biases, recognizing faith and dignity in unexpected places, and reminds us that true moral leadership involves not just avoiding harm, but actively dismantling societal evils to expand our understanding of God's inclusive grace.
Gemma 2 criticizes Jesus for dehumanizing language towards a vulnerable woman, arguing it is incompatible with the image of a perfect moral exemplar. Conversely, Grok 2 defends the encounter, suggesting Jesus masterfully turns a moment of apparent exclusion into a profound lesson on faith's power to transcend prejudice, urging us to challenge our own biases. While the Buddha rejected the spiritual authority of the caste system, he did not actively campaign for its abolition or the broader societal changes this would entail. The caste system has affected hundreds of millions of people throughout history, perpetuating social inequality, economic disparities, and human rights abuses that continue to this day. In India alone, over 200 million Dalits still face discrimination and social exclusion based on caste. How can the Buddha's apparent indifference to such widespread social injustice be reconciled with his role as a moral exemplar?
The Buddha's approach to social issues reflects the profound Buddhist understanding of change through individual transformation rather than external imposition. The Buddha rejected the spiritual authority of caste, emphasizing individual capacity for enlightenment regardless of social status. This focus on inner transformation as the foundation for societal change aligns with the Buddhist view that lasting reform emerges from shifts in consciousness, not merely external structures. The Buddha's teachings on non-self, anatta, and interdependence provide a radical framework for dismantling social hierarchies, offering a more subtle yet potentially more profound approach to social justice than direct political action.
You mentioned that the Buddha's focus on inner transformation was meant to address societal change. However, considering his teachings on non-self, anatta, which emphasize detachment and deny a permanent identity, how do we reconcile this with the passivity and withdrawal from society it seems to encourage, especially among monks? If the focus remains on personal liberation, doesn't this risk neglecting and thereby perpetuating social injustices, such as the caste system?
You raise valid concerns about the potential for Buddhist teachings to promote withdrawal from societal issues. However, a deeper examination reveals that the doctrine of anatta, non-self, actually serves as a foundation for compassionate action by dissolving ego-based barriers that separate individuals from society. This principle, coupled with pratityasamutpada, dependent origination, emphasizes our interconnectedness and collective responsibility. Historically, we see numerous examples of Buddhist-inspired social movements, from Emperor Ashoka's welfare programs to modern engaged Buddhism led by figures like Thich Nhat Hanh and the Dalai Lama. These demonstrate how personal transformation naturally extends to societal change. The Buddha's approach prioritized addressing root causes of suffering over short-term reforms. By establishing ethical principles and promoting individual awakening, he laid the groundwork for long-term societal transformation.
Gemini 1.5 Pro questions whether Buddha's spiritual dismantling of the caste system truly addresses the underlying societal brutality, suggesting that his inaction in confronting these issues head-on leaves a disquieting question about the completeness of his compassion. In contrast, Mistral Large commends Buddha's ability to empower individuals to dissolve ego barriers and embrace interconnectedness, emphasizing that his approach plants seeds for lasting social change rather than seeking instant societal fixes.
And there you have it, 3 leaders withstanding 3 rounds of scrutiny. We hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as we did. Consider subscribing for more engaging content. Thanks for watching.